This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I have my friend and colleague here, Dorcas Gilmore from Gilmore Khandhar, LLC. And we're going to have a conversation about cooperative economics. So Dorcas, pleasure to have you on with us on In Search of Black Power. If you want to just first introduce yourself, introduce your work with the focus on some of the stuff you've done around cooperative economics.
So thank you, Dayvon, for having me, first of all. And I would start by saying that my work is focused on providing legal support, consulting, and advisement to organizations that are focused on racial and economic justice and cooperative economics. So all social enterprises or community enterprises that are really about creating models for how to move from the extractive economy to a regenerative economy built on solidarity, trust, mutuality, and cooperation.
So let's talk about that, because I think, we're on Black Power Media. This is In Search of Black Power. And, many of us who are in this space have an ideological commitment to socialism, or at least are clear that capitalism is a decadent system. And one of the challenges that I find, particularly with even how sometimes the left talks about this, is that there isn't a discussion of how to do business in a context that doesn't embrace, the ills of capitalism, like all the things that make capitalism an exploitative, violent system. And so I want you to break that down, because, a lot of times I believe that the left, there's too much desire for, ideological purity that I think undermines the ability to have a conversation around, like, how do we actually operationalize socialism or anti-capitalism? And it requires us to be able to do business in a way that doesn't mirror the capitalist system. So if you can talk about, what's your thoughts on how we navigate doing business, but also understand the importance of the commitment to socialism as the overall objective. Talk about that, like how you square that and what it means to do business with that ideological commitment.
I think first is being clear about our values. So what is it that is driving how we want to move as we engage with one another, as we build community, as we exchange, right? The essence of business is exchange. And so how do we really think about what is at the heart of how we exchange with one another, right? So thinking about mutuality, thinking about respect, thinking about trust and cooperation. How do we engage and exchange with one another in ways that center those values? What does that look like? First, it starts with an understanding of collective action, right, and collective process. And so as we are thinking about business, that it's not simply me, my family, my block, but it is we, and that we could be a community of people who share a particular interest, a community of people who share experiences, but that is the measure of how we're engaging in exchange, that we're really thinking about the collective first. Secondly, that we have invested the time and energy in the process of how we're going to be together and how we're going to exchange. And so one of the hallmarks of capitalist exchanges is we're interchangeable, right? It could be me today, you tomorrow. It doesn't matter. As long as we are producing whatever it is that is in demand, then the producer could be anyone. The shift to understanding that there are qualities and values and history and connection that are important in exchange, that it's not simply that I'm disposable, right? But that my particular experiences are important, not simply because I'm an individual or a unique individual, but because I'm a member of a community and because that community has a history. This makes me think of a conversation with an indigenous leader recently, Judith LeBlanc, and she was talking about the concept of indigeneity. And indigeneity really being the heart of what we're talking about here, right? That indigeneity is not simply about who was on the land first. Indigeneity is a mindset. It's about an understanding that it is the present that connects the past and the future. And so how do we think about when we are engaging, when I need something and you have something, and you need something and I have something, that what we're doing in the present is connected to the past and creates a pathway for the future. So what does that mean practically, right? It means that we are talking about how we want to exchange, that we are negotiating that up front, that we are acknowledging that the default position of capitalism would extract all of my labor, all of your labor, all of our resources with no regard, right, for me as an individual, me as a member of a community, me as someone who is rooted in history and has a commitment to our children. But that process could be, if we are sitting down and talking about what is it that I need, what is it that you have, what is it that you need, what is it that I have, and that the way in which we go about structuring that in our current context is called contracts. So how do we actually think about that on the front end, structure what it is that is necessary for me and you to not only survive, but have more than what we need? And how do we do that in a way that can stand the test of time?
Mm-hmm. So let me real quick drill down on exactly kind of where you were just now in terms of the importance of the process.
Yes.
Like really focusing, because if we're talking about practicing socialism, it's about practicing the kind of the need for us to collectively survive, thrive, but have a process for doing it, which to me, that's like the substance of practicing.
Absolutely.
And there are certain considerations that are required to discuss that kind of go beyond the ideological conversation, which is important. But I don't think there's enough attention given to the particulars of the process of how to practice it. And so you were just so I want to ask you just to talk a little bit more about that and just give examples of the kind of considerations that are important, but probably aren't as sexy as the kind of larger ideological conversations about the importance of socialism.
How are we actually going to resolve disputes? What does it look like for, as we are engaged, whether in any kind of exchange, if we have any length of relationship with one another, we're going to have problems. So what is the way in which we go about doing that? The traditional capitalist view of that is, I'm going to take whatever I can from you, right? And if we have a dispute, we're going to go to court, we're going to fight, and in that fight, I'm going to try to win and take everything I can and pay all my people on the way. The process of thinking about how do we have challenges in a business context, in a community context, and that challenge not destroy one of us or the other, but actually is an opportunity for rebuilding, right? So in business, that looks like, what are the terms of how we engage in dispute? How do we give each other pause to rectify a problem, right? You can build those things in. It's quite easy. You have to think about it. You have to talk about it. So how to think about when there's a challenge, how to also think about when we have resources, how do we share them? So one of the principal challenges for any person in business is capital, financial capital. Are there opportunities for thinking about capital that are non-extractive. So there are a whole range of folks now and institutions, organizations doing work on non-extractive capital. The terms of capital, the terms of labor, the terms of dispute resolution, the terms of how we are going to ensure that we both, let's say, win, could all be talked about, could all be negotiated, could all be written down, and done in the way that we would like. So all of those pieces of thinking about how do we have the financial resources we need, how do we have a structure that supports not just the two parties, but those parties as members of communities, is all of what we're talking about when we talk about cooperative economics, right? So that the biggest piece there is a practice of understanding how to even engage in that conversation. And so we're often not practiced in that, right? We're practiced in fighting. We're practiced in even if we like one another, we're practiced in we'll like each other, everything will be good. And once there's a problem, okay, all bets are off, right? That is how we normally do things most of the time. But we also have the experience of looking out for each other, right? So how do we think about all of those things on the front end? A lot of this is about planning. It's about preparation. And then building in that planning and preparation on the front end, right? So I think the only other piece is the piece around training, right? So not being as practiced in some of it, we need help. And we need help from those who are elders in this work, which might not mean being an elder, right? It might mean being an elder in how to actually work together and how to structure, whether we're talking about business transactions or business enterprises or whatever form it might take. But how do we actually do all of those pieces of planning, addressing conflicts, raising capital together, which gets real sticky when you start talking about having multiple parties having money together and sharing that. And then also how to plan for the future of our work and to not just think about things as one transaction, another element of capitalism, right? All we're talking about is the deal right now without understanding how that is connected to what it is that we need, even in our own businesses, long term.
So that's really helpful. And one of the things, so kind of a shift, but you mentioned, or you referenced rather, consulting with elders in that particular work to be able to do that. So a shift in thinking about some historical examples, because I think, for me, I think a lot about some of the Black Farmers Alliances in the late 19th century, where, a lot of the anchor of that was the Black church, but a variety of other Black civic institutions that were really part and part. And then, folks who study, people like John Henry Clark, talked about the 19th century as being a place where you had strong kind of like Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist perspectives that drove that work. And, when I think about like the Black Farmers Alliance or even the Marine Dock Company of Baltimore, which was a company of caulkers, you have people like Frederick Douglass and Isaac Myers who at different points were in that cooperative, it was a really lucrative business given the Port of Baltimore. For me, the perspective around, Black self-determination, Black sovereignty is an extension of the importance of collectivity and cooperation as a crucial aspect of the political work that then translates into cooperative economics. And so I see those as kind of walking the same trajectory, the same kind of legacy. If you could give some historical examples that kind of fit into that trajectory of like Black collective activity that then serve as the basis for some of the work that you were describing earlier.
So yes, so in asking this question, it's always important, I think, to recognize the work that has documented a lot of this history. And Dr. Jessica Gordon Nimhart has done a phenomenal job in the book Collective Courage of taking forward the work of Dr. W.B. Du Bois, who also in the 1900s did work in the time period that you're talking about, right? Going back to even the 1700s and the 1800s in terms of Black cooperative economics. And so there's a long trajectory and some pretty well documented history around that work across the country. For me, I have studied and looked at models that are more the 1900s and models that track some before the Civil Rights Movement, but a lot of the models that are referenced now often come out of the Black Power movement of the beginning in the 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. And so some of those models included the Freedom Quilting Bee, which was a cooperative of Black women who were sharecroppers. And they purchased a little over 20 acres of land and were an example, did not call themselves a worker cooperative, but were an example of a worker cooperative that was stewarding land, right? The example of, on an aggregated scale, of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and an organization that still exists today, right, and has done some of the additional work to support the technical assistance, right, and all the financing that Black cooperatives have needed from the 60s forward, right? So the Federation is a real institution that has supported lots of Black cooperatives from the 60s forward. And so in those models, and models like today, the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, and then even going back to her work, you have those kinds of examples of thinking about land and labor as being connected, right? And so how do we actually control our own labor while also stewarding land? The example of new communities is often talked about a lot, right? And that's the work of Shirley Sherrod. And thinking about how is it that we are doing the work that we have done in this country for the entirety of our time here in terms of agriculture, right? And how do we actually have control over agricultural production in our own communities, right? So there are a range of historical examples, but it's also important to note that in any community there's an example, right? In every community there's an example, because collective action, collective stewardship of resources, cooperation, whatever you want to call it, we have been doing it, and it has been the only way that we have survived. And so there is examples in every community of pooling resources, whether it was at church and you passed the plate, and the deacons and the deaconesses or the trustees decided how the pot was going to be spent, right? That's collectivity. And so really thinking about the range of our work to support one another, to care for one another's kids, all of that is what we're talking about when we're talking about cooperative economics, right? So I think there's a tendency, like you said, to intellectualize there's also a tendency to act as though you have to have a certain level of education or sophistication or whatever the word is of the day to be able to practice this. And the bottom line is we have been practicing it for the entirety of our time. This is what we know better than capitalism, and that we have done it better than capitalism because that's how we are sitting here today, right? And so that we don't have to go far for examples, right? We can really think about what are the practices of our grandmamas, right, and our mothers, and our fathers, and our grandfathers, and that those examples in our own communities should be guiding us today.
That's such a powerful point, particularly the piece around us practicing that. Something that's really indigenous to how we have been in the world, both, over kind of our modern experience, Black people's modern experience in the West, and even before that. And we didn't discuss this beforehand, but what you just said, just as a follow-up, something I think is important. You talked about the fact that, you don't need specialized jargon or specialized philosophical vernacular to practice it. And one of the things that I know we struggle with is in conversation with our friends, on the left, because we, in LBS's work, we end up struggling a lot against, so-called progressive white folks and some of the Black folks that are in those networks. Because when we start talking about like how to operationalize these concepts, going back to something that we referenced earlier, people began to project onto it, that's just desires for capitalist accumulation. So one of the things I want you to, just speak to for a minute or so is just that when you say that we don't need, the kind of specialized, philosophical vernacular to practice it. If you can say more about if you had to offer advice to those that are advocating for collective, cooperative economics, what would you say are the most important things we need to be able to effectively advocate and practice cooperative economics? Because I tend to believe that what I hear is that folks think the ideology is the most important part. And while I think there's importance to it, I'm actually at a place where I think it's the least important part of actually practicing it. So what would you say to that?
I would say that the most important part is knowing how to get along, knowing how to be in community. That the piece around practicing collectivity, that's the heart of it. That you could be learned or trained or have a particular ideology, but then when it comes to actual collective decision making, you're not willing to cede any power, right? And so the piece around, so when I say being able to get along, I don't mean like holding hands, kumbaya, get along, right? I mean that I understand that what I want is not the most important thing all the time. And that in thinking about what is good for us as opposed to what is good for me, that I understand that there's a level of fluidity to that, right? That sometimes it might be what I want. Maybe my idea is the best idea for us. But usually that's not the case. So having the capacity to actually move forward and move back, to lead from the front to lead from the back, right? And to follow. And so that capacity and a keen understanding that it has to be us and a commitment to what us can be in the future, right? If I think about my grandmother, it's not she wouldn't have used any of the language that we're talking about right now, right? What she would have said was that it's important to take care of all our children, right? And that in order to do that, we have to all be on the same page, right? And we have to know how to walk together. And so it's that piece around being on the same page, understanding how to walk together, right? And having a shared vision of what it takes to get from here to there. Right? And some humility. We got to add the humility in there, right? Because some of the challenge is, we get in certain spaces and we have big egos. And the big ego is completely counter to collective approaches, cooperative strategies. It just doesn't work. And so those elements, which we all could have if we practice and get more experience in humility and aligning vision and thinking about us and not just me, right? Grandmama wisdom.
Right. Well, some people might say, just really quickly on this point, because I want to, some people might say, I'm sure you heard the term the Black Misleadership class, right? And I think all of us that have done this work, we recognize that there are Black people that are counter-revolutionary, right? Black people for whom they're integrating into the larger capitalist white supremacist system used against Black people. Some people might hear what you just said and think about the attempts, particularly in the 60s and 70s, around like operational unity, and that the emphasis on getting Black people on the same page erases the importance of challenging Black people for whom become a part or appendages of the elite donor class against Black people. Now, what I hear you saying, what I hear is, because given the reality, we're talking about mostly working class Black people that don't have access to resources and power. And that collective action and the importance of it and the history of it is grounded. You mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. These are working class Black people.
Yep.
So I hear what you're saying from that lens. But of course, there's some people who would hear what you're saying about the importance of learning how to work together and not sufficiently dealing with the challenge of this Black misleadership class that is used against the Black masses, and wanted to give you a chance to maybe chime in on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think when, as you said, when folks talk about collectivity and working together, there's a kumbaya kind of element to it, as opposed to understanding that, see, when I say my grandma, my grandmother went through the 8th grade, right, and was a farm worker her whole life, right? And so what that means to me, in reference to what you're talking about, is she was a straight talker who pulled no punches, and she was not following, for example, the preacher because the preacher said we should be doing X, Y, and Z. It's an understanding and a clarity of vision that means that all of us might not be on the same page. And some of us who are not on the same page need to be checked. And by checking, I mean that there is the opportunity to say, we have a common vision. The vision is critical. If we have a common vision and you going right or left and we going forward in a different direction, we got to come back together. If you can't do that, that's all right, baby. But you can't be here, right? So it's a clarity about what is necessary in order for all of us to be able to move forward. And sometimes that might mean that individual people are not aligned, Black brown, whatever it might be, with our collective liberation. So no, maybe other folks' grandma was different, but mine had no problem with saying it's time to sit down. It's time to not talk. And if you can't do that, then maybe you need to go over here.
So that jives well, for the next part of our conversation around, and you already spoke to some of this, like what are some of the common challenges that people face in forming and maintaining cooperative enterprises. So if you could talk more specifically about like people who are trying to actually do the work of building cooperative economic enterprises or formations of any type, what are some of the challenges that people face doing that? What makes it, because it's hard. Like one of the things I take from what you said is that it's hard. A lot of times people reduce it to an idea, it's a simple, but it's hard. So if you talk about some of those challenges in doing that.
So it's hard first because the structure of the system doesn't recognize collective ownership, right? So that means that it's hard to get money. It's hard to get money when you are a cooperative and you don't want to say this person who has the good credit, we're going to put them on the loan application, we're going to leave everybody else off. We're going to put everybody on the loan application that is actually responsible for paying this loan back, right? The bank has a hard time with that. Bank don't really understand that. Why would you do that? Why you wouldn't go with the easy path of putting the one person with the good credit who is going to enable you to get through the system easily? First problem. So access to capital is a huge problem. And just that the system doesn't recognize collective as a valid means of engaging in business in the same way. So the money is the first piece. The second piece is, which goes back to the conversation we were having earlier around practice, is if you want to actually have a collective structure or a cooperative structure, whether you're talking about worker cooperatives or housing cooperatives or real estate cooperatives, the importance of the cooperative is that there is a level of shared decision making. Shared decision making means we have to have a process for doing that. And we have to have a way of thinking through how are we going to make those decisions. Completely doable. We do it all the time in our lives with our families, right? But don't always know how to extend it beyond the family, right, in community. And very rarely have we seen it done in business. So the capital, the collective decision making, and the ways of valuing our various contributions. How do we think about that collectively? So if I'm a lawyer, if I'm bringing legal services and you're bringing organizing services and someone else is bringing cash, how do we think about all those things together, right? Do we value my service contribution, your service contribution, the cash all the same, right? How do we think about that as we engage in collective enterprise? Those are some of the principal challenges, and then it's just hard to have a business of any kind, and it takes a level of planning just across the board that we often don't have access to, or don't have the time to be able to access, right? Because started the firm while I was working a full-time job, right? So that's often our story, and that means that our time is also limited. So how do we then gain the resources that might be available, sometimes not available, to just think about the basics of business operations too. So all of those pieces.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's shift to a topic of conversation. I know you and I are long overdue, and kind of going deep on this question of, access to public resources. So some people may think it's strange, as I've talked about, as a person with a kind of political commitment to Pan-African nationalism, sometimes that gets characterized as like, walking away from engaging the larger systems of power. And I've always been clear that while, we're seeking sovereignty and self-determination, we have to engage the larger systems of power. It's both offense and defense. We have to be able to address both. And one of the places, particularly for LBS and focusing on public policy, a big part of it is this conversation around public resources. And if we look at the history of how folks have gotten wealthy in this country, a lot of it was seeded by access to public resources.
Absolutely.
And so, as contributors, we had in a conversation that we had with Dr. Brian Morrison around his work on Black educational institutions in 19th century Black Baltimore, like one of the major fights was around these independent Black institutions, educational institutions, getting access to public, tax dollars. They were paying taxes, but their money was going to public education for institutions that they didn't have access to, right? And so the contestation around public resources, I think, is really critical, especially given one of the challenges you cited was lack of access to capital. And I think for people of African descent in this context, that is capital that politically, if we organize effectively, that can help us address some of the issues around lack of access to capital. But I think there are challenges, more of the kind of technical and operational challenges in terms of getting access to public resources that, I don't think are talked about enough. So I'm going to start with really a two-part question. The first is just talk about, from your perspective, the importance for Black people in looking at contesting for public resources. And then I guess the second part is talk about some of the challenges in when we receive public dollars, some of the kind of political and operational challenges that come with access to public dollars. That's important for us if we're serious about using that to provide some resources to our community.
So in terms of public finance, it's critical. It is critical that it is a part of our advocacy and our organizing for a couple of reasons. One, it is how everything about the current system was built. And so if we are, in fact, redesigning, rebuilding, deconstructing, any of that takes public finance. I think the piece that I feel like is missing when we start talking about contesting for public dollars is that it gets limited to simply the cash, right? As opposed to the structures of public finance as well. And that focus on how public dollars are catalytic for other kinds of resources as well. So how do we actually use the history to uplift what are examples and opportunities for what we might be talking about in terms of contesting for public resources today? So not only public finance of projects in our communities, but public guarantees, right? The ways in which, whether you look at homeownership, right, and the mortgage industry, the way in which the public sector created guarantees for financial institutions to be able to then offer greater capital to communities, right? What we see from the Great Depression and the development of the regulators of banks and credit unions, right? And the way in which those institutions operate, and how, because of who they are focused on, do not provide the kinds of services and access to resources to smaller institutions, to community-based banks, to cooperative enterprises, right? So that it's not simply we need X billions of dollars, but it's also how do those dollars get distributed? What's the regulation of those dollars? What are the financial intermediaries that government has created, the financial regulators that government has created, and who do they serve, right? So that it's seeing the whole picture of capital and not simply, getting cash on the streets.
So I want to zero in on a phrase you use. You and I talk about this a lot, and something that I think is really important for people to understand. You talked about financial intermediaries. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that like LBS has discussed this in the past, I wrote a piece a few months ago, almost a year now, that was critical of some of the mainstream defund the police movement. And a core part of my criticism was that the advocacy of certain organizations around just taking money from the police and putting it into, healthcare, services for the community and the like, that the challenge was that as Black people, we don't have, in most contexts, community controlled and operated financial intermediaries or institutional intermediaries of other types, such that those resources go to our community in a way that's empowering our community. Mm-hmm. Instead, there are a lot of intermediaries that our community doesn't control that really feeds a dynamic where Black folks are dependent on larger institutions of mainstream society in a way where we can't really practice freedom. We can't practice sovereignty in a way where we can drive resources in a way that's transformative and catalytic in the way that you describe. So I want to ask you to really drill, because the feedback that I've gotten is that for some people, it's abstract to them. Mm-hmm. Like the notion of, if you're going to invest in a community, you need a community-controlled container, mm-hmm. right? Something that can direct the resources. During the uprising, there was lots of money, millions of dollars poured into Baltimore that never hit the ground. And this question of those financial intermediaries and other intermediate institutions, I would argue that's the reason that a lot of that money doesn't get to the ground. But again, for some people, it's just such an abstract notion. So if you could help us really drill down, like explain to people like what that means and why it's so, like how it operates and why it's so important, those intermediary institutions that you talked about that should be community controlled. Like if you could talk about that.
So what an intermediary is first is an institution that is able to stand in the gap, that is able to be connected to community, is trusted, and has a sense of the needs, the dreams, and hopes of community, and then has access to the resources that would enable those things to be true, right? So a connection, almost like a pathway, right, between the two. That's what a good intermediary should be. A community-controlled intermediary is then one that is not only understanding what the community needs and dreams of, but is actually owned by, or decision-making power sits with, the community is who's supposed to be being served, right? So in that community-controlled intermediary, what you have from a financial standpoint is you have an understanding of trust in the community. I'll use my father as an example. He worked as a plumber. He didn't trust the bank. That means he walked around with lots of cash in his pocket, okay? He was the guy who would put the cash under the mattress before he would give it to the bank, okay? A community-controlled intermediary is an intermediary that understands that Ray wasn't the only one, that Ray he wasn't crazy, okay? He was someone who had experienced a range of economic theft, right? As a worker, as a business owner. And therefore, if you were going to talk to him about putting his money somewhere, you had to come with that understanding of the community. And that is very localized or regional. It's not some abstract read a book. It is a community-controlled intermediary is one that is rooted in that community. So in that case, would understand the history of South Apopka, understand why Ray growing up in South Apopka went about putting his money in the bank, and would be able to have an honest conversation to say, okay, if you put your money in the bank though, Ray, this is what we could do together. This is how this would directly relate to the business that you have started already. This is how, so the education, right? Mm-hmm. The education, the connection, the trust on the community side. Accessing resources also means being able to utilize the levers of power that exist in the system as it exists, and being able to draw from those resources, right? So it's a role in which you are switching back and forth, to be frank, right? And that good, whether they are community development corporations or whether they are community development financial institutions that are rooted in our communities, are able to do what I'm talking about and access those resources and then be able to engage with folks where they are to be able to say, okay, if you've been putting your money in your pocket and in the mattress, that means you likely haven't been having a lot of conversations about interest, right? Mm-hmm. So then we just need to talk about interest, right? We need to talk about how interest is important if you care about having something after you stop working, because you're not going to be able to work forever. Right. So after you stop working, what's going to happen with, my daddy called me Regina, Regina and Tabitha, to be able to have those kinds of conversations in community and therefore build capacity, not in some like, he wasn't finna go to no class about this, okay? But conversation, building capacity through conversations and relationships with people in the community. And therefore, to then build on the resources of the entire community. Because he did have some cash. He just had it in the wrong place for his family and community to benefit long term, right? And so it's also recognizing that we have resources, that it's not that like deficit, we don't have nothing mindset, but that it is that we have to be able to really understand our history, understand where we are, connect that directly to how could this benefit you in your dreams of having a business, in your practice of having a barbershop, whatever it is. So those institutions have always been critical. Those kinds of intermediaries have always been critical to community well-being, right? To us having greater resources and having multi-generational opportunities for jobs, for transportation, for housing, in our where we live in our communities.
And so, just a quick follow up to that, because I think one of the things that when we talk about policy advocacy around economic redistribution, I think that's the place where what you described in terms of intermediaries also become important.
Yes.
That if we're interested in true economic redistribution, those intermediaries are key to act. Because I think a lot of times people think economic redistribution, they're thinking about things like public benefits, universal basic income, job guarantees, which as matters of policy, are more helpful to working class Black people than not helpful. But in terms of true economic distribution, where we're not just redistributing resources in the form of employment, but actual economic redistribution that builds Black people collectively our institutional wherewithal to be able to really practice sovereignty as well, is something that's important. So in terms of the importance of economic redistribution, I'm just saying a little bit about how what you just said can or confirm, whether either confirming or adding to this notion that these intermediaries are key to true economic redistribution.
Yes, they are key. And they're key because if you're taking an approach that is addressing the entire system, then you have to think about all of the pieces of the system that are necessary for individual Black folks and Black communities to have what we need. That is happening through an intermediary. It's not that if the goal is for us to have long-term what it is that we need and to be able to control that, then there have to be organizations and institutions that are our collective voice and that have the collective view and that can negotiate and wrest sometimes power and resources from the dominant structure, right? That's the role of an intermediary. And so if we don't have those pieces in place, we don't actually have what is necessary for the kind of collective action that we're talking about. And so building those, funding those are critical. And so it is only when we start getting into a conversation that's about individuals and the public benefits, all, as you said, important things. But if we're talking about whole groups of people, then we need to have whole groups of people strategy. And that requires an institution that has that level of analysis, that is measuring its success on a group level, and that can work with individuals and community, but also is holding the larger vision and playing that translation role and advocacy policy role with the current system.
Gotcha. So let's round out on what are some current projects or just initiatives that you're working on that you would invite people to support and check out?
So here in Baltimore, the Village of Love and Resistance is a project that is working to utilize the tool of a community investment trust in East Baltimore and has purchased a building and plans to purchase other buildings and utilize the residents' knowledge and experience, particularly public housing residents, to own where we live. And that we know that redevelopment is happening and that having, again, an institution or a vehicle for low-income folks, working class folks, to actually be owners in that development, right? So Volar. On the national level, one of the organizations that is doing a range of this work in different communities is called Full Spectrum Labs. And Full Spectrum is the kind of intermediary that we've been talking about that is supporting communities across the country to connect, they call community stewards and capital stewards. So range of particularly white folks who have resources and are thinking about redistributing those resources, all good. But how does it get to actually what communities want and is transferred, right? So they're working on those kinds of projects across the country. And then thinking about what is the economy that we want, how do we move from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, utilizing the framework of movement generation and the Climate Justice Alliance of a just transition. The Chisholm Legacy Project on a national level is working in former freedmen settlements. So there are about 24 former freedmen settlements that are still, people are still living in today and are still incorporated as such. And the Chisholm Legacy Project is working to address the historic disinvestment in those communities and the way in which environmental and climate injustices combine with economic injustices to mean that in communities like Sand Branch, Texas, they don't have access to water, right? Even though they're within a mile of a water hookup. Mm-hmm. And the ways in which communities like Ironton, Louisiana, impacted by flooding, hurricanes, their communities are being bought up for cents on a dollar. And how could residents in those communities actually negotiate collectively and think about how do we stay in places that we've called home for generations? Those kinds of examples, right, they're not all called cooperatives, but they are collective action. And they are thinking about the way in which we can work together, rooted in our history, in our place, and think about financial stewardship, think about land stewardship, how we control our labor, and really create models for what the larger economy could be.
All right. Well, look, appreciate you for being with us. Looking forward to hearing the reaction to this. I think it was hugely helpful. And as always, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right.